So let it be written, so let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and this is Learn to Play D&D Reborn, Episode 2. First, if you are watching Episode 2 and you missed Episode 1, title card. Check that out. It is the first video in the series, and you might not understand anything we talk about today unless you watch that. Now, the second thing is, this is not a history of Dungeons and Dragons. Finally, this is specifically for Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, and we are going to do our absolute best to teach you the rules as they are written in the book, and then from there you can diverge and make it your own. So, without any further ado, let's get into Part 2, Learn to Play some D&D.
So it is worth noting real quick before we get too far into the specifics that when it comes to D&D and role-playing games in general, the rules as written are not always exactly what happens at the table. Sometimes people don't necessarily read every rule right, or they just want to play and see what happens, and maybe they don't get everything right. Or sometimes people like to change the rules to suit their own styles and the way that they want the game to feel and the way they want the game to play, or borrowing rules from other systems that they might like to bring into D&D. So we're going to talk about the baseline rules as they're written, but it's worth saying that if you end up at a table and some of these rules are slightly different, it's probably because the GM has taken their own liberty to change some of the rules to suit exactly what they want to do. And that's totally okay for them to do. And very much in the spirit of role-playing games is to tweak things to taste. So you may encounter that if you end up gaming out in the wild somewhere, but we figured it was worth saying that we're going to say exactly what the rules say are in the book, but if you see them differently, that's probably why.
Now remember, if you saw in our first video, there is a special player called the Dungeon Master or the DM. In other role-playing games, it can be called the Game Master or the GM. We use those terms interchangeably in this video. So if you hear us say DM, we mean Dungeon Master. If you hear us say GM, we mean Game Master. It is one and the same. One is just a copyrighted / trademarked Wizards of the Coast property, Dungeon Master. So, let's talk about the core rule. The main rule, the one umbrella rule that covers all of Dungeons and Dragons. If there is something that happens in a game and the outcome is uncertain, and there's a chance of failure, like we talked about in the first video, D&D uses the roll of a 20-sided die, called a D20, to determine whether or not there is a success or a failure. If you know that rule, you know most of D&D. The rest of the rules sort of come into play, altering, shifting, changing, interacting with that particular rules. And there's a lot under that very, very big umbrella. But the first thing I want to do is I like to remember things, and I have not talked to Jeff or James about this. I thought about it on the fly, and I'm going to roll with it. I like to remember things by doing little sing-songy stuff. So there are 3 things you have to remember in D&D when rolling this D20. In the game, there are 3 main kinds of this D20 success or failure roll. There are ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. Now, I'm going to go over what those are very briefly, but first, I want you to just remember ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. I said ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. Ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. I said ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. Now, if Jeff throws a beat behind that in post, we'll see. But as silly and as ridiculous as that might sound, you're going to be at your refrigerator and you're going to go ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. An ability check is a roll to see what your character can do. Maybe something dealing with how athletic you are, how smart you are. An attack roll is taking your weapon or your spell and hitting another creature or an object. And a saving throw is basically rolling to protect yourself from something like a falling rock or someone shooting a fireball at you. That is the core concept of D&D 5th edition's rules.
So the core rule will always follow these steps. You'll take your die, your D20, you will roll it, and whatever number comes up on that die is the number you start with. Your character a lot of times will have modifiers for their abilities depending on what you're trying to do. You will add that to the number of the roll, and then that will be the number that decides whether or not you succeeded. To know whether or not you've succeeded, everything in the game has a difficulty class. The difficulty class is the difficulty number you have to hit to perform a task or action. It's called the difficulty class for just about everything, except for in the case of trying to hit creatures or other objects that have things like armor. It's called the armor class. But they're effectively the same thing in the sense that they are the number you're trying to hit it. If you hit the armor class, you've hit the creature. If you hit the difficulty class, you've succeeded in the action. So the D20 that you roll for all of these things adds the random element, and you pair that with the character you create. You decide a lot of different things about them, what their stats are, how strong they are, maybe how smart they are. Of course, some characters might be stronger, some characters might be smarter, and this would make them better at different things. But no matter what, when you roll that D20, you add whatever modifiers you have from your character creation, and that gives you the number you're trying to hit. What this means is that a 10 is usually pretty easy to hit for normal characters with a reasonable modifier. A 15 is a little more difficult, but still possible for a lot of people. And then a 20 would be very difficult. Most characters without a specialization, like a high number in whatever they're trying to do, would have a hard time hitting something like that.
And something that's important to remember when it comes to, these different things saying this, 10 is easy, 20 is really tough, and those sorts of things, is that depending on how good the characters are at what they're trying to roll for, those numbers might be much easier or much more difficult to hit. So if I'm playing a character who's been, in the game for a long time, has gotten really powerful, and they're doing something they're really good at, a 20 might actually be pretty easy for them to hit because of how much their modifiers have grown by the time they've gotten that strong. Whereas if I'm just starting out and I'm having to make a roll that my character's really not that great in, even a 10 might be a struggle to hit. So those numbers can fluctuate pretty widely depending on exactly how you make your character. And we'll go into what makes that sort of modifier happen and how you get all those numbers later in this video. But just know that that's a good baseline to follow, but they can really go far one way or the other. So I think it might be useful just to see something like this in action. We've been talking about, this very core rule that's sort of central to D&D, and it is. But it can be a lot easier sometimes to sort of see something happen rather than just hear something happen. So I figured we could just do a quick check real quick. So in this scenario, I'm the GM, I'm running the game, and I'm going to say that Tim's character is trying to jump over a gap. He's on a cliff face, he's trying to get from one edge to the other edge, and he has to jump. And there's a chance that he might fall, there's a chance that he might make it. So I'm going to have Tim. Tim, is your character good at this sort of like acrobatic stunt work or no?
Probably very median. So I'm not awesome at it, but I'm also not bad at it. Just pretty generally okay.
So again, we'll talk about how to get these numbers, but let's just say for the sake of this example that you'll have a +2 to your modifier. So I'm going to say the DC for this is not going to be that difficult. I'm going to say it's going to be DC 10. Just you probably are going to make the jump, but if there's still a real risk that you could fall. So if you'd like to just roll me your D20.
Yeah, so that is. All right, I got a 15 on the die.
All right, so then because you have a +2 modifier, you'll add that +2 to that 15, which will be 17. Because 17 is greater than the DC 10 that he had to meet, he will succeed at this check. So Tim's character will be able to jump over, land on the other side, no problems, no worries, and be good to go. And that's kind of how the basic modifier and DC system works in 5e.
Awesome.
So now that we've kind of talked about the basic core rule, that D20 roll that sort of defines everything in D&D, there are a couple ways that roll can be modified or changed depending on specific situations that might come up. One of the most important ones to 5th edition is the idea of advantage or disadvantage, where basically if you're in a situation that's particularly helpful to what you're trying to do, you can roll with what's called advantage. And the way that works is you'll roll 2 d20s instead of 1, and whichever one has the higher number, you keep that dice instead. So if I want to jump across that cliff face, but I have advantage, maybe because I have specialized climbing tools that might make me better at, jumping across, I can roll, 2 d20. And if I get a 5 on one or a 15 on the other, I'd keep the 15 instead of the 5, and then I'd add my +2 to that. So I'd have 17 on that roll. And disadvantage is the opposite, where if you're in a particularly bad situation that's going to make it more difficult to succeed, you'll roll with disadvantage, where you'll roll 2 d20 and you'll keep the lower results, which will make it much more difficult to succeed. There are also other ways that numbers can be added or subtracted to your total dice roll. We're not going to get too far into specifics of exactly those situations, but certain abilities in the game might give you extra dice that you'll roll. So you'll roll a d4 and add that to your result and things like that. But they're generally pretty niche, so we won't cover all those examples here. But just know that those situations might come up later down the line, and we'll address those when we get to them.
So one thing to remember with all of these rules, there are a lot of rules in 5th edition, and these are the basic ones that we're teaching you today. There are magic items and character classes and monsters in the game that specifically bend or change, or even in some cases break these basic rules to get a different feel at the table. There's a concept in 5th edition that goes like this: specific beats general. What we're teaching you are the general rules. But if you're reading, if you're playing, and you come across anything that is more specific, that changes anything we're teaching you here, go with that specific rule. And, as always, the Dungeon Master has the final say at the end of the day, either way.
So earlier when we talked about the core rule, we talked about ability modifiers. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about how you end up getting those ability modifiers. You have ability scores for your character. There are 6 of those. And then you have skills. There are a lot more of those, and they begin to get more granular. But we're just going to talk about ability scores, and then later you'll see how skills play with those to get all of your modifiers for many of your roles. There are 6 ability scores in Dungeons and Dragons. There is strength, which measures your physical power. There's dexterity, which measures your agility. Constitution measures your endurance. Intelligence measures your reasoning and memory. Wisdom measures your perception and insight. And charisma measures your force of personality. The number of each of these ability scores that you get during character creation decides what those modifiers are. But again, when we do our character creation video, it will become more clear how we end up on those numbers.
Something to mention about those modifiers and how you get those numbers and where they come from. It's just a decided thing. Just like the names of musical notes or anything else, at some point the creators of D&D had to decide on a set of numbers and a range of numbers. I've always wondered how they got there and why they started at a certain number and used the math, and the truth is, they just did and have a starting point. So when we show you that equation, you'll see it's just like learning anything else. It's just a starting point.
So now tying those ability scores back to that core rule, that singular D20 roll. So these ability scores give you different modifiers depending on the situation that you're trying to accomplish. And different ability checks or attack rolls or saving throws will reference back to these ability scores. So for example, if you're trying to lift something heavy, you'll roll a d20 and you'll add your strength modifier, versus if you're trying to remember an important piece of information, you'll roll just that same d20, but then you'll look at your intelligence modifier and add that instead, because it's, dealing with memory instead of with lifting something. And every check in D&D, or at least nearly every check, references directly the ability score that you'll use for that check. And typically the rules will say very clearly, or the GM will decide if it's not, which ability score you'll use, and that's which modifier you know to start with when you actually go to roll that d20 and add that number.
So this is a good opportunity to talk about skills. If you're creating your character, think of your ability scores as your raw aptitude, your untrained basic ability as a human. And then think of skills as being your training in different areas of those abilities. Now, in 5th edition, there is a list of skills, okay? They cover a broad range of capabilities. Now, you have skills related to every ability score except for Constitution, but they each handle different aspects of how a character interacts with the world. So just because you're naturally high in dexterity, that ability score, doesn't mean that you're skilled as an acrobat. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're skilled at palming an object. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at sneaking around in the shadows. But those are 3 skills that you can get better in. So how does that relate to actually rolling and the modifiers and all the things we're talking about with this core rule? Jeff, tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, so just as the ability scores have a modifier that they add to your die roll, the skills also add a separate number to your modifier as well, which kind of makes the total modifier of the die roll. Now, it's a little bit different because skills don't have individual modifiers like the ability scores do. They have something called a proficiency bonus, which is basically a number that your character has that's just one single number. It's just one single number that increases as the character gets stronger throughout the game. But basically, a skill is more like a checkbox than a number in terms of it just says, are you good at this skill or are you not good at this skill? And if you're good at the skill, then whatever your proficiency bonus number is, you add that to your ability score modifier, and that will make the total roll. So for example, if I'm rolling to do something acrobatic, I'm trying to do a flip. I would roll my d20. I'd look at my dexterity modifier, which might be a +3. And then if I have a proficiency bonus of 2 and I'm good at acrobatics, then I add that to make the final roll +5.
A good way to think of it is this. In former versions of Dungeons and Dragons and in other games, there are a lot of different numbers or skill ranks that you used to have to track. And it can become very confusing and have a lot of bookkeeping. What your proficiency bonus is one static number that you reference. And as Jeff said, it's like a checkbox. So it makes it way easier to track one number. And that number is determined by the rules, and it's just something you reference. It's way easier to look at that and then look at, say, is this box checked? Yes, I get to add that number. Than it is to do a bunch of bookkeeping on a bunch of skills and adding a bunch of points and ranks. So this is just 5th edition's way to refine skills down to one big number that then refers to a bunch of other little things. It makes it way easier once you learn it.
So a saving throw, also called a save, is another thing a little bit like a skill that's going to be on your character sheet. But this is something that represents an attempt to resist a spell, a trap, a poison, a disease, or a similar threat. These are in a different section, but in a lot of ways act just like skills. These will be decided at character creation, but your saving throws that you have proficiency in, just like your skills, will add your proficiency bonus, as well as your ability modifier, and in those ways, they're just like skills. But you don't normally decide to make a saving throw. A saving throw is something you're forced to do because your character or a monster or something is at risk of coming to harm. A good example of this would be if you are in a dungeon and the dungeon master says, you look up and at the last moment you realize a boulder is going to fall on top of you. Your character gets a chance, in this case, a dexterity saving throw. You would roll your d20, add the number that you have on your character sheet there, and that would decide whether or not you got out of the way of the boulder. And that would be an example of a saving throw.
It's also important to note that a saving throw also has a target DC, depending on how difficult it is to get out of the way. So just bear that in mind. All right, so what else? Guys, we talked a lot about ability scores, modifiers, skills, saving throws, and we've kind of hit on a lot of that in terms of like how they play into these, either these difficulty class, these DCs, or an armor class, an AC, but what else? Did we cover it all, or is there anything else we really need to hit on to make sure that everyone knows where we're at?
So there is one more type of role that very slightly changes the way that the rules work, and it's a very simple change, and that's basically everything that we talked about with like skills and saving throws. It's always kind of been, you against the environment. Can you jump over a cliff? Can you avoid a rock? But there are some instances where you'll need to go against another person who has their own agency, and in that case, we would do what's called a contested roll, which is basically, instead of rolling a dice and comparing that to a static DC that you have to meet or beat, a contest is both people involved roll, add all their modifiers, and whoever's number is higher wins. So, for example, if there's an item that falls onto the ground and two people at the same time want to spring and try to grab that item off the ground before the other person can get to it. Maybe it's a super important or valuable item and they want to make sure it's theirs. Both people might roll a dexterity check to see who's going to get there first. And if one person rolls a 13 or one person and the other person rolls a 16, the person who rolls a 16 will be able to beat the other person and grab the item that fell. So it's basically just a way to say if two people need to compete against each other to see who wins, instead of a static DC, they'll compare their rolls against each other, and whoever's number is higher will succeed at doing what they set out to do.
So you now understand the core rule of D&D and sort of how it works, at least at a high level. But we've covered a lot. We've covered quite a bit. And so I think it's really important to sort of wrangle that all back in and do a brief recap of exactly what you learned so it can really stick and you can remember this core rule.
So the foundation of D&D, the rule above all the other rules that sort of sets the game in motion, is the D20 roll, which is, as Tim mentioned before, if there's ever a chance that you might succeed or fail at something and you need to know what happens, you'll roll this dice and then you'll add numbers to it based off of different things. There are three main types of rolls that you'll do. An ability check, which ties into your ability scores and your skills that you're proficient in. There's the attack roll, which is whether or not you can hit another creature with your weapons. We'll talk about that a lot more in character creation and combat. And then there's the saving throw, which uses your ability scores and then your saving throw proficiencies. And that's to avoid danger that's that the GM has set against you. And all of D&D follows behind those basic rolls, and they all use that same D20 where you'll roll your D20, you'll add your ability score modifier, and then if you're proficient in either the skill or the saving throw that's being called for, you'll add your proficiency bonus to that as well, which is determined also in character creation. And we'll talk a lot more about how you find those numbers, like, well, what's my ability score modifier? What's my proficiency bonus? How do I know? We'll cover all that in character creation when we talk about that in a lot more detail. But the basic rule follows that format, and you'll use that D20 roll for nearly everything across the entire way that D&D is played.
In the comments, you can put any questions that you have, because we have done our best in this first and now the second video to really give you as many core fundamentals in the right order that we can. But there are probably things that maybe we didn't explain as well as we think we did, or maybe you just have further questions. We would love to hear those. We will continue these videos, of course, and continue along the path. But if there's anything you need to know now, drop it in the comments and we'll see what we can do. We would love to help. All right. So that is Learn to Play D&D video number 2. And I think let's end this thing with a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
punch.
I really went for it there.
Yeah.
You sure did.
You did. Yeah. That is one way to do it.
I'm telling you, you'll be singing it.
So
I'm not sure what it is, but you did really go for it.
Okay.
So I know we're all just dying to make your life so much harder, Jeff, now that you have an ambition for video editing. But that would make a really good end card.